The Reserve Bank of Australia Governor Phil Lowe has got an incredible solution to fix the current housing crisis. Get ready for it. He wants you to get more flatmates or stay living with your parents. This is from the same RBA who have destroyed housing affordability by artificially inflating house prices. I'm Biko Konstantinos, and that's what we're going to talk about today. If you'd like to be earning around $1 million a year, like RBA Governor Phil Lowe is, then why don't you crack this video a like? And if you'd love to be able to buy an expensive property with extra generous mortgage perks, like Phil Lowe did, then consider subscribing to my channel. You can enjoy all my content without ever having to say, sorry.
The underlying issue here is supply and demand in the rental market. The vacancy rates in many cities are very low.
That old chestnut, supply and demand. Every time you hear someone mention that, just know that they don't really want to try and improve housing affordability. It's just something simple to say because it's something in the future. So even if you say we're going to increase supply, more development and all that, if it doesn't work out, it'll just go into the too hard basket. You'll shrug your shoulders and say, oh well, we tried. And just remember, Australia builds some of the most properties per population in the entire world. And guess what else? We've got about 1 million properties just sitting vacant. So blaming everything on supply is a little bit rich.
I was in Perth earlier in the month, and there it's basically almost impossible to find something. The rental vacancy rate's the lowest it's ever been.
Now Phil might have a nervous smile, but wouldn't you try and control it? It's quite a terrible look to be smiling when you're discussing that it's near impossible to find a rental in Perth, because that means there's real lives and real families suffering due to this rental crisis. No time to smile, Phil. You never smile at funerals, you never smile when your partner gets the directions wrong, and you definitely never smile when you're discussing the worst vacancy levels ever.
During the pandemic, the average number of people living in each household declined.
Alright, so Phil's now prepping us to say that the entire housing crisis is because during the pandemic, more people wanted to live by themselves. But guess what Phil doesn't say during this Senate hearing? He doesn't say that the RBA reduced rates to zero, kept them there far too long, even though there was massive indications of wild speculation in the property market, and for 12 months while rates were zero, Phil kept telling us that he didn't expect interest rates to rise until 2024. Hey Phil, it's only 2023 and we've had 11 interest rate rises. Is that something we should be smiling about? That you made one of the worst forecasts in central bank history across the entire globe, and by doing so basically screwed up the entire housing market, pouring fuel onto an already overheated property market and sending prices up 30 or 40% just in 1 to 2 years? You didn't mention that as a possible cause to the current housing crisis, Phil. You see, if house prices weren't so expensive, more renters could afford their own home. And guess what else? Even before COVID, the RBA kept interest rates far too low for an economy that was quite strong, and that also fueled over leverage into property. And now we're left with an economy that's massively distorted into property. But we're not going to mention that, Phil. We don't want to take accountability for our past decisions. Remember, supply and demand.
And the other thing that's now happening is a big increase in population. The population's increasing by 2% this year.
He's right about that. We're currently running immigration on steroids. And an increase of 2% while we're in the middle of a housing crisis is a recipe for disaster.
Are there 2% more houses? No, hardly, the rate of addition to the housing stock is very low.
But Phil's only worried about the housing stock being low and not able to meet the 2% immigration rise. And yes, I get that, but guess what? The government could actually reduce those immigration numbers and say, hey guys, we're in the middle of a crisis, we'll just reduce those numbers to help us get through things to try and ease the current supply issues and then reevaluate it later. Could that be a novel idea?
It just doesn't it doesn't work.
The entire housing market doesn't work, Phil. We've created a two-class system in Australia of property owners and non-property owners. And young people, through no fault of their own, have inherited a broken market where it's extremely difficult to be able to afford your own home on two incomes when just 30 years ago, a one-income family could easily afford a home and easily pay it off within 10 years. How about that for royally screwing things up?
The way that this ends up fixing itself, unfortunately, is through higher housing prices and higher rents.
What a wonderful solution! We're gonna fix the housing affordability prices through higher house prices and higher rents. Why didn't I think of that?
Because as rents go up, people decide not to move out of home, or you don't have that home office, you kind of get a flatmate.
Which is a...
So higher rent prices will keep people living with their parents until they're 45 or 50 years old. And we'll have more full-time workers having to have flatmates because that's the only way they can afford the rent. Guess what they do in Hong Kong, which is one of the only places that has worse housing affordability than Australia. But considering they've got a massive population in a very small area as well, unlike Australia, people there who own units subdivide the unit and rent out the other half or sell the other half or something like that. Maybe Phil is wanting us to become more like Hong Kong. But since Phil seems to love this idea of sharing accommodation so much, maybe he should try it out for himself. Someone who was able to buy a mansion with a special perk mortgage is completely out of touch with reality. You know what else higher rents mean for some people, Phil? It means they could get kicked out onto the streets. It means they might lose their jobs. It means absolute havoc for their living circumstances. And that's not something to smile about.
Well, the increase in supply can't happen immediately, but the higher prices...
Higher house prices, Phil. We have to have higher house prices.
They do lead people to economise on housing, don't they? Kids don't move out of home because the rent's too expensive, or you decide to get a flatmate or a housemate.
You heard him, guys. Share that accommodation and stay with your parents. Phil won't do it, but you have to. Remember, we're the lucky country where the Australian dream is to work 2 jobs to try and afford the rent and potentially buy a house one day. But by the time you've saved up for a deposit, house prices have risen another 30%. So you'll be forever pushed out of the housing market. Thanks, Phil.
That's the price mechanism at work. We need more people on average to live in each dwelling, and prices do that.
You know what Australia needs? We need more people to take real action to improve housing affordability. And we need more than people just talking about supply and demand. Since the 1990s, nobody talked about a supply issue, yet house prices rose massively faster than wages during that entire period. So there's plenty that could be done to reduce overall demand for housing, because using property to gain wealth in Australia has now become a religion.
It just doesn't it doesn't work.
Enough said. I'm Biko Konstantinos.